19 سال بعد از اشغال سفارت آمریکا در تهران توسط دانشجویان پیرو خط امام، در مورخه جمعه 9 مرداد ماه سال 1377 و یک سال بعد از روی کار آمدن دولت اصلاح طلب آقای خاتمی، نشست مشترکی بین یکی از دانشجویان تسخیر کننده سفارت آقای عباس عبدی که در اون مقطع دیگه در کشورش یک روزنامه‌نگار مشغول به کار بودن، با آقای برای روزن، یکی از دیپلمات هایی که در اون مقطع در سفارت بودن و بعد از 444 روز به کشور خودشون برگشتن، این نشست در مقر اروپایی سازمان ملل در یونسکو در شهر پاریس فرانسه و با مدیریت اریک رولو، دیپلمات سرشناس فرانسوی و روزنامه‌نگار شهیر وابسته به روزنامه لوموند فرانسه برگزار شد که در نوع خودش نشست حائز اهمیتی بود. با توجه به اینکه گزارش این نشست به صورت اسپشیالی تنها در اختیار تلویزیون صحراست و تاکنون هم جایی دیده نشده، بی مناسبت ندیدم که این گزارش رو به اتفاق پخش کنیم، منتها چون این مقدار زمانش بلنده، بالغ بر 2 ساعت و نیمه که طرفین دیدگاه همدیگر رو به سمع و نظر یکدیگر رسوندن، این گزارش رو 2 ساعت و نیمه رو در 5 نوبت نیم ساعته و در 5 روز در تلویزیون صحرا میتونید ببینید و امیدوارم مفید برای اون دسته از عزیزانی که پیگیری میکنن مسائل سیاسی و به خصوص مسائل سیاسی مترتب بین ایران و آمریکا رو مفید باشه. توجه شما رو به دیدن این گزارش جلب میکنم. در تلویزیون صحرا تلویزیون را سابسکرایب کنید و ببینید.
که این جلسه خارج از روابط رسمی و دیپلماتیک محل مناسبی برای کاریک شکافی روابط نیم قرن اخیر ایران و ایالات متحده است. فقط چنین کالبد شکافی به اصلاح درک ما از آنچه که گذشته است کمک می‌کند و این امر ما را در ساختن آینده امیدبخش و به دور از تحقیر و سلطه میان دو ملت توانا می‌سازد. در پایان از برگزار کنندگان این جلسه، یعنی مرکز گفتگوهای جهانی و همچنین آقای اریک رولو که در اداره این جلسه شرکت دارند، تشکر و تقدیر میکنم. همچنین از این که صحبت‌های من گوش کردین خیلی متشکرم و سپاسگزارم.
Et maintenant, je donne la parole à Monsieur Barry Rosen.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I start with my formal remarks, I'd like to say that my wife, Barbara Rosen, and my daughter, Ariana Rosen, are sitting here in the front row. My wife, Barbara, played a very important role, along with many other of the spouses of the hostages, in attempting to free us from captivity. In point of fact, during the crisis, she had visited with then President Giscard d'Estaing and was seeking the help of the European countries to help in the freedom of the American hostages. And my daughter, Ariana, was only a year and about 3 months old when I was taken hostage. And my love of Iran is shown in the name of her name, Ariana, which does mean of Iran. Now for the formal remarks. I want to express deep appreciation to the organizers of today's panel. They deserve congratulations for the extraordinary efforts that gave birth to this event. I should caution that I am speaking not as a former press attaché, but as a private citizen, and not for the other Americans who shared my 14 months plus of captivity. But before I talk about general issues, let me start with a scene from a young American's visit to Iran. It came during his stint as a Peace Corps volunteer, when he felt deeply involved in the lives and doings of students, friends, and families, which were a kind of a surrogate family of his own. Then the last day arrived, a time for his students and him to say goodbye after 2 years of English classes. Following some formal ceremonies, they went to the teacher's house to spend some final moments together. Soon, a class leader approached him with a large book and asked his Ustad, his professor, to open it. It was the Koliyat Divan Shams Tabrizi, a complete collected poetry of the famous Iranian mystical poet Rumi. All the students had inscribed their names in perfect Farsi calligraphy. Yes, it was in my grateful hands into which this magnificent book of classical Persian poetry was placed that day in 1969. Of course, I was deeply moved. Beyond that, however, it confirmed that my work in Iran was valued and respected by the people most directly involved. Now, why am I meeting with Mr. Abdi today, whom I know as only one who helped cause much personal trauma to innocence? I hope you'll understand that my most difficult dilemma in nearly 20 years was whether to agree to join this panel with him, meaning to put my resentment aside. But it was precisely the opportunity that felt right to me, both in timing and as an expression of an old conviction of mine. I sensed the time had come to put close to 444 days that brought me great pain, partly because I want to enjoy the anticipation that a new page in Iranian American history may soon be turned. Released from Iran to an overwhelming American reception, I happened to glance at a sign in one of the celebratory parades. It read, US 52, Iran 0. Even then, and more now, such nonsense was wishful thinking, mostly nurtured by people who resented that we hadn't won, part of the proof which lay in me and my distress. What we called the hostage crisis was actually closer to a defeat for both sides, and no amount of celebrating could transform it into a triumph for anyone. Its legacy of distrust, misunderstanding, and hatred diminished us for 2 decades, making both sides losers. But must both sides be bad losers? Isn't it time to face the unhappy legacy? It is rooted in myths, which like most contain elements of truth, but also exaggeration to make it difficult to break down that wall of mistrust that leaders on both sides want to surmount. This is not to suggest, not for a second, that the past need not be confronted by both peoples. On November 4th, 1999, some 50 Americans who served their country, seeking genuine Iranian-American reconciliation after the revolution of 1979, will enter 20 years of reflection about a defining episode in their lives and the lives of their loved ones. I must be candid about that. The people who squashed the human rights of those Americans may ignore that blatant violation of accepted international standards and norms. But no matter how they rationalize, however, they must face up to the wrong and admit, if only to themselves, that it was unjustified. But this is not a platform for remembering only my pain or blows to American honor alone. Iranians also suffer deeply. Looking back at a relationship exclusively only through one's point of view isn't very helpful. It's crucial to understand why Iranians, in turn, feel pained and hurt by the United States. Not to launch into a history lesson, it's worth remembering that the American presence in Iran began with idealism, missionaries, and advisors. As an aside, let's not forget that there was an American hero in the original 1906 Iranian constitutional revolution, Thomas Baskerville, who was sometimes called by Iranians and others, and Americans, as the Lafayette of Iran, who fought and died for Iranians in 1906 and contributed to the constitutional revolution. Many Iranians forget that today. But let's go on further into Iranian-American history. Later, and until the 1960s, American policy shifted to serving as a kind of guarantor of Iranian independence against Soviet incursions, as well as a provider of generous economic aid. But our intervention against the legitimate nationalist government of Mohammad Mossadegh dimmed the Iranian perception of America. A reawakened sense of nationalism, which I believe Iranians feel as keenly as they did 45 years ago, encompassed hostility to America almost by definition. Yes, the United States continued to work to ensure the mutual interests of both countries by preserving Iranian territorial integrity. Unfortunately, the same power realities that led us, the United States, to play a key role in preventing Moscow from separating Azerbaijan and Kurdistan from Iran in 1946, a very positive role, led us in 1953 to 1978 to policies that alienated Iranians. Those policies derived not from malice toward Iran, but from geopolitical demands, as we saw them, of fighting communism. Still, we often saw Iran more in terms of mutual needs for continuing that fight than in terms of what most interested Iranians themselves. But let's not indulge in the easy exercise of looking backward and recount hurts. I'm convinced that personal, national, and international crises that followed our long captivity and the 2 subsequent decades of animosity between our countries is coming to an end. Whether my presence here can have any meaning beyond this room is something for others to discuss. But I want to stress that both countries want and say that they want a cultural dialogue like today's. It is a very important step toward reconciliation. However others will interpret the meaning and symbolism of today is not clear to me. But the rift between Iran and the United States, to understate it considerably, began well before my captivity, which, however, powerfully widened it, especially because both sides tended to see U.S.-Iran relations as a story of heroes and villains. The past can't be made to go away, and shouldn't. But a new beginning can be made. We can work toward a wiser, kinder time when our countries are able to agree to disagree, as in all good relationships between nation states as well as people. I'm here with Mr. Abdi because I want to see Americans and Iranians turn that difficult corner away from mutual demonizing. Candor also requires acknowledgement that we're only taking the first baby steps toward that road toward reconciliation. You do not need to tell me that major issues separate our countries. Anyone who has followed the policy nuances over the years knows them all too well. But my personal knowledge from my Peace Corps experience in 1967 through 1969 assures me that our torn relationship can be mended. Reconciliation is possible. Finding the right soil and climate that enable us to restore our mutual trust and respect will be difficult. The essential nutrient will be the process of humanizing each other, which must include acceptance that both of us have viable views and grievances worthy of acknowledgement. Only real dialogue, as opposed to the drumbeat of moral lecturing, can initiate that humanizing process. Its focus must be on issues that are important to both sides, avoiding all attempts to dig in entrenched attitudes. President Khatami's groundbreaking interview with CNN, where he called for a dialogue between civilizations, was very encouraging. So were Secretary Albright's remarks last month, especially her call on Iran to help create a roadmap to normal relations. The same applies to President Clinton's announcement that Washington genuinely wants reconciliation with Iran based on mutuality and reciprocity. Unfortunately, Iran's test of medium-range missiles only 8 days ago raises anxieties in an already tense Middle East and puts doubts about its foreign policy intentions. Nevertheless, this is one of the rare opportunities when two previously hostile governments and the most enlightened of their respective citizens genuinely want peace. And precisely because it is important that both countries understand each other's intentions. For example, in regard to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, nothing can replace a direct dialogue between the two governments without any preconditions. I agree with some of Mr. Abdi's recent remarks in Salam last month, especially that it is useless to rationalize rejecting normalization by citing who inflicted what pain on whom and when. If formal words are the criterion, should not Iran, as he questions, adopt the same attitude towards Russia because of the loss of Persia's northern territories? His reference was to the early 19th century when the Russian Empire overwhelmed the Iranian army of the Gajars and appropriated large chunks of land in the northwest of Iran. So here's the critical question. What will it take to enable those Americans and Iranian negotiators to sit down together? It will take what peacemaking has always taken: honest reflection, foresight, and courage. The alternative, leading from a difficult, rewarding path toward normalcy, is interminable confrontation. To move on that path would also take something else. Both countries' leadership and the general public must deal with their domestic demagoguery. For example, non-experts in the United States hardly recognize the considerable recent changes in Iran. On the Iranian side, politicians who favor rapprochement are often immediately condemned because the United States essentially remains the mythical great Satan on whom everything bad and unwanted is blamed. The solution is no less urgent for being obvious. Favorite myths of both countries must be deflated. On the American side, we must acknowledge that the revolution, with its anti-Americanism, was rooted in valid injuries to the Iranian people, and that the Iran of the last 9 years is abandoning much of the radicalism of the past. On the Iranian side, leaders and people must modify their black and white view of the world and of the United States in particular. Yes, Washington did make mistakes, but it did protect Iran from the Soviet threat and will continue to do much good, even if inevitably faltering sometimes. Rather than criticize every American policy and action and rejecting relations, Iranians should criticize selectively, rejecting what they think is improper, but embracing the positive. Believe me, there must be some positive policies. In practical terms, several things can be done to break down the myths that have been holding us hostage. As President Khatami suggested, people-to-people dialogues like today's are crucial. Secondly, honest statements by political leaders on both sides about mistakes and positive acts in the past and the present will help ease reconciliation. We should also seek suggestions about constructive initiatives that both countries can undertake as confidence builders. Also, both countries' intelligentsia can help deflate the demonizing myths by writing more objectively about the tangled relationship. Mr. Abdi has taken up this challenge already. In the same article I referred to above, he courageously wrote that, quote, hostility towards the United States has become a matter of prestige in Iran. Now I'd like to end with another scene from that same young American Peace Corps days in Iran. My Iranian teaching friend and colleague, Farhad, first introduced himself to me, not by inquiring why I was so bald, so young, as did many Iranians in their reaching out for chumminess, but by looking at me as an individual, as if I were a long-lost friend and a man who deserves the highest respect. In Iran, that's tarof. His eyes announced that he had no interest in competition with me, but that he wanted to care for me, almost take me in as part of his family. Farhad made me feel as if I were terribly important to him, that my comfort and happiness were the most interesting and significant matters he would encounter all day. I believe that my relationship with my Iranian colleague deeply affected our lives. The impact resonated because we saw each other as real people, not as mythic figures of one or another sort. Let's now do the same. Let's see each other as we are, and the building will almost inevitably go on from there. But before I end, I want to recite a poem from a famous Iranian poet, Sadi, who said, Beni azam aze yektegaran ke dar afarinish ze yek goharan. What Sadi said is that the human race is of one another, for they are both created by the same essence, the same gohar, the same precious jewel, God. Thank you very much.
Voilà, le dialogue a commencé. Des points de vue, comme vous avez pu remarquer, ne coïncident pas, loin de là. Mais avant de donner la parole à la salle, je voudrais demander aux deux intervenants s'ils souhaitent se dire encore quelque chose. Monsieur Rouzen, est-ce que vous avez quelque chose à dire à Monsieur Abbas Abdi et Monsieur Abbas Abdi? Vous avez quelque chose à dire à Rouzen? Très bien. Monsieur Abdi a quelque chose à dire à Monsieur Rouzen. C'est parti.
من فکر می‌کنم که اولین نتایج مثبت این گفتگوها تو این جلسه آشکار شد. شاید هنگامی که گفتگوها نزدیک و غیر رسمی بشه، طرفین نسبت به گذشته دیدگاه‌های منصفانه تری پیدا کنند. نکاتی که آقای روزن تو مطالبشون فرمودن در مورد تاکید بر نقش آمریکا در سرنگونی حکومت ملی دکتر مصدق و همچنین ناراحتی‌هایی که در ربع قرن بعد از اون و حتی بعد از اون از این طریق به ایرانی‌ها رسیده و اینکه سیاست ایالات متحده در این مقطع هیچگاه نگرش مثبتی نسبت به منافع نداشته، بلکه بیشتر حالت ابزاری در مواجهه با شوروی داشته و بالاخره اینکه هنوز انقلاب رو به رسمیت نشناختن، من فکر می‌کنم نکات بسیار مهمی بود که آقای روزن به اون اشاره کردن. ولی به نظرم میاد که بهتر بود که ما بیش از اینکه رنج‌های شخصیمون رو مطرح کنیم، رنج‌های یک ملت رو مطرح می‌کردیم. ما میتونیم هر کدوممون در زندگیمون رنج کشیده باشیم، همچنان که کشیده ایم، ولی رنج‌هایی که یک ملت بی‌دفاع از خودش می‌کشه اون طی 25 سال به مراتب اهمیتش بیش از رنج‌های شخصی هست. من میتونم 444 روز گروگان باشم و من میتونم از آزادی محروم باشم، ولی این حق، این یک مسئله گذرایی است. اون چه که برای ما باید اهمیت داشته باشه گروگان بودن یک ملت طی 25 سال و باقی موندن آثار اون طی مدت‌های مدیده. چه خوب بود که به رنج‌های دیگران اشاره می‌کردیم قبل از اینکه به رنج‌های خودمون اشاره کنیم.
Merci, M. Abdi. M. Rosen, vous voulez répondre?
I would first say that I feel very strongly that I did delineate what I felt was the American role in Iran from 1953 to 1978 very clearly. I feel very strongly that the United States did play a role in undermining the nationalist government of Iran. That was very clear. Secondly, one cannot neglect personal grievances too. And they were not just personal grievances, but in point of fact, I and my fellow colleagues did spend 444 days in captivity, and I would have to disagree with Mr. Abdi on one very, very important point. There is a moral imperative there. Mr. Abdi maintains that we were treated well, or that was a relatively non-violent situation. Mr. Abdi might have been planning the captivity of the takeover, but personally he was not in the embassy or in the many places that we were held. I think the Iranian people all too often have only seen the grievances in terms of their own. They do not know anything about the hostage crisis at all. They are vacant about the pain that the American diplomats felt and experienced throughout those 444, yes, miserable days. But again, one of the most important things I want to stress, and I know Mr. Abdi feels that way too, is that it's tiring and useless to go over the same ground over and over again. All too often that's what we hear. The important thing is looking forward. For every tit that Mr. Abdi has against the United States, and I would say there's validity to many issues. There is another tack on the American side. Most importantly, we cannot play around with moral issues, whether the captivity was kinder than something else. There's a moral imperative, and I think we should think about that. But again, the important thing is the future between Iran and the United States, not the past. Let's not dwell constantly on who did what to whom and when.
En réalité, les deux intervenants estiment qu'ils ont assez dit jusqu'ici et ils nous ont dit beaucoup de choses. Et moi, je pense que c'est quelque chose de très positif. Le dialogue s'engage bien, une fois au moins pour deux raisons. La première, c'est que chacun nous a donné son point de vue, sa perspective des choses, et c'est un bon début pour un dialogue. Et les deux nous ont parlé de souffrances. L'un nous a parlé des souffrances personnelles et de ses collègues à l'ambassade, l'autre nous a parlé des souffrances du peuple iranien. Et à partir de ces deux je dirais, acquis, puisque parler de ses propres vues et parler de ses souffrances, je crois que c'est un bon début pour un dialogue qui pourra se poursuivre ultérieurement. Alors maintenant, je vais vous demander de lever la main pour poser des questions à l'un ou à l'autre. Oui, monsieur Hilou.
Monsieur l'ambassadeur, le débat historique n'est pas prêt de s'épuiser. Pourrait-on demander à monsieur Abdi et à monsieur Rouzen de se mettre côte à côté du micro et de nous dire quelle a été leur impression, leur pensée, leur sensation lors de leur première rencontre à Paris?
Je ne sais pas s'ils sont disposés à se lever et à se mettre côte à côte pour vous faire plaisir, mais ce dont je suis sûr, c'est qu'ils voudront bien répondre à votre question. Vous avez compris la question?
I can translate. I was saying that the historical debate has just begun. It'll take obviously a long time to settle the questions, but we would like to know if both of you could stand together at the microphone and let us know about your personal mutual reaction on the time of your first encounter in Paris.
Monsieur Rouzen doit répondre. Après monsieur Rouzen, monsieur Abdi.
این سوال شاید از این تصور ناشی میشه سوال کننده یا دیگران فکر میکنن که یک دشمنی شخصی بین دانشجویان و گروگانها وجود داشت، در حالی که اساسا چنین چیزی نبود. هر کسی دیگری، هر یکی دیگه از مردم ایران میتونست جای من باشه و هر آمریکایی دیگری میتوانست جای آقای روزن باشه، بلکه اینجا احساسی بود که علیه یک دولتی که 25 سال ایران دخالت کرده بود. بنابراین هیچ احساس منفی نه من شخصا و نه فکر میکنم دوستان دیگرم در اون جریان نسبت به شخص آقای روزن وجود نداشته که امروز خلاف اون احساس رو بخوام بیان بکنم. فکر میکنم برخورد امروز هم همون روز بود، فقط در دو موقعیت کاملا متفاوت.
This is not Marxist historical imperialism. I am a human being, and though I understand Mr. Abdi's point of view that what he was doing, he thought he was doing for the betterment of the Iranian Revolution. But I am still a human being, and I think Mr. Abdi does accept that, though he maintains this was not personally against me. In point of fact, it was personally against me. I spent 444 days in captivity, missing my family, and I was in prison, just as Mr. Abdi had spent time in prison himself. I don't think it was personal against him. I mean, it was non-personal against him. It was certainly personal against him. But I have to say this. I don't want to harp on issues that separate us both. I want to move away from that. All that questions like that do make it difficult, more and more difficult, and feed the demagogues on both sides and make it difficult for us to move further. I wish the questions would be ones that have more substance to them rather than less substance.
Bon, la prochaine question, s'il vous plaît. Madame Laura Lewis.
Je voudrais demander à M. Abdi, je note...
Non, on vous donnera... vous avez un micro près de chez vous.
Ah bon, ça va. Merci. Je note dans la résumé de M. Abdi qu'il a été très actif en appuyant la Révolution jusqu'aux deux derniers points qu'il a été emprisonné et qu'il a été frappé d'une interdiction publique. Comment cela se fait-il, après tout ce qui passe auparavant? Est-ce qu'il a changé de point de vue? Comment explique-t-il cela?
این بحث ما در مورد این نیست که در کشور ما چه می‌گذرد. در شرایط کنونی هر چی می‌گذره به خودمون مربوطه. من می‌دونم با اون کسی که به من ظلم می‌کنه این مسئله کاملا شخصی و به خودمون ربط داره و قطعاً نتیجهش یک نتیجه مثبت. بحثی که ما در مورد گذشته داریم بحث دخالت شخص ثالث، دولت ثالثه، اونه که ما را عذاب میده. هیچ این تصور پیش نیاد که ما فکر میکنیم که تمام مشکلات ما 100% از جانب ایالات متحده یا کشورهای دیگه بوده. ما عین هر کشور دیگری مشکلاتی داریم که کاملا به خودمون برمیگرده، ولی بخشش هم میتوانه ناشی از دخالت عوامل دیگه باشه. ما به همون دلیل باید به عوامل دیگری که در سیاه‌روزی ما شراکت داشتن در ایجاد اون بپردازیم. بنابراین اونچه که من زندان بودم کاملا مربوط به مسئله داخلی ایرانه و من در مورد مسئله داخلی اینجا صحبت نمی‌کنم. این امکان برام وجود داره، در ایران صحبت می‌کنم و انشالله در آینده هم خواهم.
Oui, monsieur.
Une question à poser.
On vous entend pas, voulez-vous répéter?